to see everybody here. Yeah, the kids are going to head out to Children's Church. That's for 3 years old through second grade, so they're headed out that way to go have a good time over there. It is good to see everybody today, whether you're here or online. We're glad that you're worshiping with us, and if you're visiting with us, welcome. Again, same thing, here or online. It's a busy day here at the Vine. We seem to do this sometimes, where we have a period of time without much extra events, and then we cram them all into one day or weekend. So that's what today is. And so we have our senior blessing tonight, this afternoon at Miller Park. And towards the end of today's service, after this communion time today, we're going to have a slideshow video of pictures of some of our seniors as a way to kind of honor and celebrate them and get a look at them. And so that'll be after communion today, and then tonight will be a night to celebrate and with them, with their families, and to have a good time together. We're also, of course, as Zoe said, saying goodbye to Rachel and Hezi today as they move on to the next phase of their adventure. And Rachel and Hezi have been a great blessing to our church. Rachel has filled a lot of gaps for us. And, you know, with a small church, you need people who can wear a lot of different hats. And Rachel has worn a lot of different hats and worn them well. And I've learned from Rachel and her wisdom and compassionate spirit. So sad to see y'all go, but know that God will bless you in your efforts going forward. And then there will also be, Jason may mention this again at the end too, but Jason's going to meet briefly with some of the youth parents and those who are interested in youth work after worship today. So plenty of stuff going on today. And plenty of stuff going on the heels of a busy and tumultuous week for many of us as well. I know, again, we've got several senior families here who are navigating the emotions of a graduating senior and all that involves. Families looking forward to the beginning of summer, end of school, and everything that goes on there. And of course, we have difficulties as a country, as a nation, as people with the shooting in Uvalde this week, and navigating all those emotions is a lot. And so I want to begin this morning with the psalm from Psalm 13. It says, "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me." Maybe some of those questions, some of those wrestlings resonate with you this morning. Maybe for reasons that are sort of common to all of us, things like the Uvalde shooting. Maybe for things that are specific to some of us, like seeing a senior graduate. Or maybe there's inner turmoil or battles or struggles that you are facing that everyone else doesn't even know about or would even know that you're undergoing. But I think we struggle with some of those questions. And I know for me, in weeks like this, not to personalize it too much, not to personalize tragedy too much, but I know in weeks like this, I always struggle with, what do I say after one of these shootings or events? And unfortunately, I've had a lot of practice in it, and I don't know that I have any great answers yet. But this week, part of what kind of began to shift in my mind was, instead of thinking about that personally for me, I started thinking, what should the church's response be to gun violence and violence in our country? And so that's what I've been wrestling with and thinking about. I don't have any great answers today, but I'm just saying that's where my thoughts have been wrestling this week. And I think it's part of the struggle for us as Christians and as church of kind of living in the time that we do, is we could use that rubric and ask that question about a number of different topics and issues and pressure points. And so that's something I know that we all wrestle with. And it's part of the struggle and the difficulty of being a Christian, being a Christ follower, probably at any point in the history of time. But it certainly seems like it now in sort of a state of polarization and differences of opinions. And so how do we move forward trusting in God's unfailing love and move forward well? So maybe those are some things that you're wrestling with this morning as well. Psalm 13 also connects well with the story that we're going to be looking at in Genesis this morning also. Because one of the things that we heard in this psalm is David struggling with these feelings of sort of isolation and being forgotten. David is wrestling with what does it mean? What does it feel like? What do I do when I feel like God has forgotten me? I don't know about you, but I think a lot of families have a story of leaving a kid somewhere, forgetting a kid maybe at church or home, the grocery store, the mall, whatever it may be. Luckily, our family doesn't have one of those stories, knock on wood. We've never left a kid. Now, we'll probably leave one today, but we've never left a kid anywhere. I don't remember ever getting left somewhere. I do have a memory of, as a kid, of my grandparents coming to visit us at our house one time. And my grandpa showed up at our house, and my dad went out. I think he showed up at my dad's office, actually. My dad went out to meet him. Hey, how you doing? Good. He's like, where's Mom? Oh, she's in the back asleep. He said, no, she's not. She just called me from the gas station down the road. You left her at the gas station. And so this was the day before cell phones and texting and everything. He said, oh, I thought she was just asleep in the back. He said, I was talking to her the whole time. She never answered. I don't know why he didn't turn around or look in the rearview mirror. I think he had said something snarky and she hadn't responded, so he just thought she was mad or sleeping. So they had to go back and get Grandma. So we don't have a story. We don't have a story of losing a kid, but we do have a story of leaving Grandma. But in some way, shape, or form, whether it's you've been literally left or not, I think we all know what it feels like to be left out, to feel forgotten, to feel lonely or isolated. I think we know those feelings. And the feeling of being forgotten by God specifically was a common question that Israel wrestled with over the course of their history. One of the questions that David poses in this psalm, in Psalm 13, this question, how long, is repeated over and over again in the Psalms. There are other times where that is the idea of that, the kind of the feelings that are embodied in that are repeated even in less direct ways. But even that specific question, how long, shows up repeatedly across a number of separate and different psalms. So for instance, here are questions. All of these questions come from different psalms. My soul is deep in anguish. How long, Lord? How long? How long will you assault me? How long, Lord, will you be angry forever? How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Relent, Lord. How long will it be? How long must your servant wait? And so again, all of those questions are from different psalms and probably speak to different moments in life, different situations, different points of struggle and difficulty. But it's a repeated question that Israel and its poets and prophets continue to ask. Sometimes even feeling as if things are so bad that God must certainly be kind of aligning himself with the enemy or with the unjust or with the wicked. Because in their minds, there's no other explanation for how things could be this bad or how we could be in this terrible of shape. And one of the ideas that has sort of been running underneath this series is this idea that Genesis very well could be a response to questions that Israel is asking about itself, its God, and its relationship with God. And so perhaps one of those questions lurking beneath the surface here is, how long? Have you forgotten us? How long are you going to keep us waiting? And so with those questions in mind, we're going to kind of look at various points of the flood story today, the story of Noah and the flood. And with some of those questions in mind, I want to look at what comes actually right after the flood. So this is in Genesis 8. We're going to be kind of in Genesis 6 through 8. The rest of the verses that we're going to look at specifically are going to be on the screen this morning, but we're going to be in some kind of various places in Genesis 6 through 8 this morning. But right after the flood, we read this. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals, and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. That phrase, but God remembered, I think is a vital phrase to this story and to what the storyteller in Genesis wants us to hear about this narrative. Because it's easy to see the flood story as one of vengeance, judgment, and divine anger and retribution. But perhaps it is primarily designed to tell the story of a God who remembers, even when it seems like all hope is lost. And so I want us to have that ending and that concept in mind this morning. And I do, though, at the same time, want to at least acknowledge and recognize that someone might say, okay, that all sounds great, Warren, but the flood story is one about a lot of death and destruction. There's a lot of God wiping everybody out in this story, which is true. Fair enough. And we're going to explore that at least a little bit today. But I still don't think that it is primarily a story about an angry God. I think even in that, even in the destruction, I think it is primarily a story about a grieving God. About a God who is grieving over his creation and over what has happened and then over sort of how things have gone this sideways this quickly, which is kind of where we ended last week with some of the Nephilim stuff, where it's like things have just gotten bad. And so I think we see a picture of a grieving God here. And like many other stories that we already come to in Genesis, there are numerous interpretations about how we could read this story. Does it refer to an actual, literal, global flood? Could it be a story that provides meaning to a more regional flood as people are looking back, trying to explain something that happened? And like the creation story at the beginning of Genesis, there are similar flood narratives in other writings and religious texts from the ancient world. And at least a couple of those stories also include a Noah-like figure saving at least a portion of humanity on a large boat. So it seems like these are sort of questions and issues that people of this time were wrestling with across a number of backgrounds, beliefs, worldviews. And I think one of the things, though, that Israel is trying to do in the telling of this story is to once again say, there's something different, though, about our God than the ones that you're writing and talking about. Our God is different. Because the Bible's flood narrative tells about a God who actually commits himself to his creation in a new, distinctive, and everlasting way through the events of the flood. And so again, this is a story that seems to be about why this God, why Yahweh, why God, the creator and sustainer of the universe and people and everything in it, is different from these other gods, what Israel, what we as believers in Christ and God would call false gods that these other nations are worshiping. And so with some of that in mind, the flood narrative is set up in Genesis 6. So we're going to read Genesis 6, 5 through 8 then this morning. It says, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time." Now, if you're someone like me that struggles with absolutes sometimes, there's a lot of absolutes in that sentence. Every inclination was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. Let's pause there for just a second. So the word there that's translated here in the NIV as regretted is a word that could also carry with it the idea of repentance. This is God lamenting, basically, the idea that he has made people. At least that's how, again, we're presented with the story in Genesis. That's how we're told it, which is sort of a rough thing to think about and consider. Then it says he was deeply troubled. That word could also be heard as being displeased or grieved or sorry. And so that verse is why I think this is really a picture of just a God in a state of grief and turmoil. God is the one that we see wrestling with the way that things have gone. God is in turmoil. And so initially God says, I'm just going to wipe all life off of the earth. So we continue then in verse 7. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So initially it seems like God's so troubled by all this, he says, I'm just going to wipe everybody out. And then it's almost like there's a shift, and there's this sort of this recognition of Noah then. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so instead of wiping everyone out, God ends up saving Noah, his family, and a selection of animals on the ark. And if we were to pause the story there without knowing what comes next, if we were just to kind of stop there and say, what would you expect to happen next? Which again, I know is kind of difficult when we know the story. The Noah's Ark story may be one of the most well-known even outside of a kind of a Christian context. And again, it's one that we typically think of as a kid's story until you read it as an adult and you think, maybe not so much. Maybe there's some difficult stuff here. But if we pause it there and try to kind of suspend belief and say, I don't know what happens next, what would I expect to happen? At least for me, what I would expect to happen is God to say, all right, we're basically going to hit reset, and we're going to do something different with people going forward. I'm going to create them differently going forward. It seems to be that God recognizes the issue, right? The issue is the human heart is evil. Every inclination, only evil all the time. So if you're going to kind of wipe everybody out and start over, it would make sense to me to say, and we're going to fix this heart thing. Like we're going to kind of go in and do whatever needs to be done to do kind of divine surgery on the human heart and to say we're going to fix it to where this issue doesn't continue post-flood. That would make the most sense to me if we're telling it kind of from that point of view. I think that's what we would expect to happen, for there to be some adjustment made to humans so this all doesn't happen again. And so things can go better post-flood. Because again, it seems like God has recognized kind of the culprit, and so we would expect there to be a solution to it if we're going to hit the reset button and start over. But, and this is an important part of the story, I think, God doesn't really enact any type of adjustment or change to humans in a post-flood world. There's nothing really about people that changes. It doesn't take any time at all post-flood for sin and evil and violence to come right back into the picture. And so the whole flood thing could just appear like a big failure. Like we started over, and now people are just going back to evil and violence and sin right away. We're right back where we started, it seems. So what's going on here? And I think what we're going to find is that if there's a difference, if there's a change, even if I could be so bold as to say that, post-flood, I think we see it actually in God and in the ways that God decides and commits to interact with and to be committed to and to be in covenant with people and His creation. So we're going to come back to that. But when the flood itself is described, it is pictured as sort of an undoing of the creation narrative of Genesis 1. If you remember back to the beginning of Genesis, in the creation narrative, it says God separated the waters. So He separated the waters from the earth and from above the earth. And so, especially in the ancient way of kind of understanding the earth and the cosmos, they would have had this understanding of there being kind of this firmament, as you may have heard others describe it as, above the earth, which is where kind of the waters above the earth are held, which would kind of have explained rain and stuff like that in the ancient world, right? And so there's this water that's held above the earth, and there's water underneath and on the earth. And these two things are separated, and there's something that is holding these at bay and restraining the chaos of these two bodies of water. And so if Genesis 1 is a separating of those two to bring order, the flood is almost an unleashing of that in order to just reintroduce chaos to this established order that God has created. And we kind of read about that in Genesis 7, where we read that on that day with the flood, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. So almost as if, again, if God kind of put in barriers, put in, dams basically on kind of the earth and the heavens at the beginning, it's like God now just opens those and everything just comes flooding back out. After the flood, then, is when we read that God remembered Noah, as I said earlier this morning. And as God remembers, the waters recede. And then we read this. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily from the earth. And so now we see order being restored. Eventually then, Noah, his family, and the animals come out of the ark. They offer up a burnt offering to God. And upon smelling the pleasing aroma of that offering, we're told that God says something to himself in his heart, which is an interesting thing to think about. Almost as if God is kind of having this moment of contemplation, meditation. And this is what he says in his heart. Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. Notice here, God recognizes the human heart is the same. Anyone who has kids knows the truth of a human heart being evil from childhood, right? Like, if you don't believe in humans born sinful, have kids. Like, once we had kids, I was just like, that's true. Like, it's just, this is the way people are from the beginning. And so, God is kind of acknowledging that here. He's like, people are evil. They're evil from childhood. There are all kinds of existential questions we could ask about that, right? Like, well, why would God do that? I don't know. These are questions I don't have answers to. He gives us choice, all those things that we've talked about in this series so far. But it's the same language that came in early before the flood, and now God is using the same language right after the flood. But he says, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. I think the flood narrative is not so much a story of creation being made new or different, as it is a story of God declaring something new about himself. It is a story of God choosing something different for himself going forward. What God doesn't do in a post-flood world is to say, I'm going to make it to where humans can't choose their own way. I'm going to make their hearts incapable of evil and selfishness and pride and arrogance and violence and everything else that we see. Instead, he is the one who is made new. It is God who commits continually to grieve over his creation without destroying it, to wrestle with humans, to commit himself to his creation in a new way, and to acknowledge that humans will forever be in need of unmerited grace and mercy. I think that's part of what we see in God's speech to himself there, is this recognition that these people are going to need my continual love, grace, and mercy, and I'm going to give it to them freely. God ends up then establishing a covenant with Noah in light of this commitment that God is making. And as part of that covenant that God is making with Noah and with all future generations, it says, God provides a rainbow as a sign of this commitment. And about that sign, about this rainbow, he says this, whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. So this morning, part of what I want us to hear and to know is that God knows that you are in need of grace. And God chose long ago to offer it to you. God chose to love you and to remember you. And so may this week be full of reminders of God's rich, deep, and abiding love. And may his love spur us to lives of service to him, love for others, and a deep and abiding sense of peace. Each Sunday when we come together, we share in the communion meal. And in doing so, we are called to remember the God who remembers us. I know many of us, some of us, probably grew up in churches where we had the table at the front, right, where it said, do this in remembrance of me. This is something that we're called to do, to remember Christ, to remember what Christ has done for us. And I think part of what it's designed to do within us then is to remind us of the commitment that we are making to God each and every Sunday. That in light of God's love and grace and mercy to me, I'm going to choose to live that way in my own life. I'm going to choose to live a life of grace, mercy, and love toward others. I'm going to choose to live a life of service in the kingdom. I'm going to choose to the best of my ability to navigate this world of questions and turmoil and situations where I don't have answers with faith and grace and peace and purpose. And so may this communion meal this morning be a time for us to do that. May it serve as both comfort in knowing that we are forgiven and saved through Christ and His blood, as well as encouragement to live faithfully in His presence and in His love.